You notice there in our title, Sacrificing All for the Lord. And many of you know that one of the strange things, at least to us, about Esther is that the Lord is not mentioned anywhere in Esther. Now, his presence is clearly there. We see the history of the Jews just laid before us, not specifically, but in a way for us to understand that God's involved with these people. This is a passage, particularly down there in verse 15, where it says, skip back to 14. If you keep silent at this time, liberation and rescue will arise for the Jews from another place, and you, your father's house, will perish, and he who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. This is a classic passage where we go to try to maybe understand the providence of God. There's a couple of passages in the New Testament that kind of lead us in the same direction, but I've seen it in people's lives that there are times when we wonder what's going on around us, and maybe God's trying to move us in some particular direction. Not miraculously, but through life as it is. There's no doubt, there's no question that Esther is a rather amazing character. She gets to be the queen of Persia. Ahasuerus was the king because Ahasuerus' wife, Vashti, didn't want to go visit a drunken party that her husband was throwing. She said, I'm just not going to do it, and so she was removed. And then something happens. This girl named Esther is among a group that's brought together. They have kind of like a super spa going there for quite a long time to get everybody all prettied up. But Ahasuerus is trying to find a new wife, a new queen. And what happens? Esther is the one who gets chosen. There's nothing really significant about her. She is noted as being very beautiful. I'm sure, knowing what we do know about Ahasuerus, he wanted to show off his Vashti because, she was, I think, relatively pretty. But we're getting to see these things happen. Now, a lot of times, what you will say and what I will say is when we see something happen, we are thinking, well, maybe I'm supposed to do something. And I'm certain that this happens a whole lot more to each of us in our lives. And probably in this particular case, it seems like that our friend Mordecai, her substitute father, there's always a lot of arguments about what the relationship is, but he obviously is her leader and director. And things start happening to him. And I don't think he notices that this is taking him in any particular direction where anybody's going to really have the opportunity to obey God. This Haman gentleman, who was a member of the king's court, had pretty much the big head, and he liked people to bow down in front of him. Well, guess who decides he's not going to do it? Mordecai. Well, before that, something else has happened. The king was almost dethroned and killed. And Mordecai found out about it, and the word got to the king, but I suspect it probably was a pretty big deal in many ways. But again, I want you to understand here that, God is not mentioned. But you see a lot of things happening where somebody draws a conclusion that somehow God wants me to do something. Now, whether that's true or not, you and I can argue about that if you want. You can say God doesn't work that way. Many people would say he does. But anyway, Mordecai, refusing to bow down to this guy, eventually gets him in big trouble. And it's the whole nation that's going to get in trouble because Haman has decided he doesn't like this guy Mordecai, and so he's not only going to kill him, he's going to kill the whole nation. And I don't know what Mordecai is thinking at this stage. Remember what the theme is, what do we do here? Sacrificing all for the Lord. There are these things that are happening, that, again, where devotion to the Lord is not mentioned. But in this particular case, what happens is it looks like the nation of Israel is going to be destroyed. Well, Mordecai knows that his relative is in the court, and the first thing he thinks of is, I need to get in touch with her so maybe she can put a stop to this. So all this is happening. All these events are happening, and I dare say, you might think of it this way, that you've been thinking about someone and you've been wanting to maybe share the Lord with them, and then you run into them at the store. Now, a lot of us, under those circumstances, given the fact that there's some sort of previous thought or event that happens, we think, wow, well, maybe this is something I ought to pay a whole lot of attention to. I don't think you have to make it some sort of unique experience to you, but you're looking for opportunities. I'm looking for opportunities to do what the Lord wants. And so you say to yourself, a little bit like Mordecai, as he's trying to encourage Esther to do something about it. I mean, how do you know? Maybe this is why you're in the kingdom. Now, I think this can happen on all kinds of levels, in very personal ways. It doesn't have to be a clearly big deal here, because all these things have happened. And Mordecai, it seems to me, and I think it's a conclusion that's, I think, useful, and that is, he sees all of this happening, and he's kind of scratching his head, if you will. And he's thinking, now maybe he's seeing the Lord's involvement in it, but he also may just be looking at this and saying, wait, A plus B plus C plus D, how does all this stuff is happening? And maybe it is God's work. And so that's how he puts it to Esther. And, of course, the point that we're hitting at is she needs to be prepared, like most all of us, to do something good, do the right thing. And I think it's worth noting what she did do. That here it is, she's just seemingly drawn into this at a point where she's a little out of the loop, so to speak. But Mordecai gets her into the loop, and he says, this may be something big for you, or maybe this is just your perfect opportunity to do what God says in understanding who God actually is. And I know all of you have these experiences where you think, how did that happen? You'll have a dream about someone, and then you'll see them the next day, and you can't help but just thinking that's kind of odd or strange. But I don't think it's a bad thing if you look at that and you think, hey, maybe there's something going on here. I'm looking for the opportunity to be a help to someone or teach them the gospel, and now I've got this opportunity. Maybe I've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And she just got after it. She got her prayer group all together, and they started praying and they started fasting, because I think at this point there was some question as to what she actually could do, but that was where she started. And she didn't have to sit down and have a big long meeting with anybody. She just told her colleagues, if you will, and I'm sure some of them were her underlings, here's what I want you to do. We've got to do something. We've got to start praying so Israel doesn't get destroyed. And Mordecai has really challenged me. He says, maybe this is the reason why this whole thing happened, where a girl like you would end up in the court of the king. Maybe he's just wondering. He doesn't say maybe God's working, but it would be difficult to think that there's not something going on here, because all of these things happen and fall in place. Now, I'm not saying that you should get all wrapped up in trying to interpret everything that's going on in your life, but realize that there may be things going on in your life that are pointing you in an opportunity or to an opportunity to serve the Lord. And we have to be ready. We should be ready anyway. And that's what Esther shows. She didn't just throw up her hands and look at her leader or her parent, if you will, and say, I don't know what to do. She just immediately goes into action. Then, of course, we don't have time to get into it, but then she is able to create this environment where this bad guy who was going to kill Haman, who was going to kill the Jews, ends up looking like a real jerk. And he is the one who gets punished. All those things happen. And it all started with Esther just being someone who was in a beauty contest. I mean, that's the way it looks in the text. I know God knew what was going to be happening. I knew Mordecai was kind of wondering about it. I mean, how do we know? There must be a reason for all this, is kind of the way he's looking at it. And so I want you to think about that. I want to think about it, is to look at circumstances in our life and see them as opportunities. And you don't have to work through it in any sort of mystical way. Just think, boy, I've got this opportunity. I should do something about it. Yeah, I think we learn about the providence of God. At least it's implied there in the book of Esther. But I think we more get from it the idea of when the time comes, be ready to jump. Move in any way you can toward serving God and helping God. That's really all she did. This is what I can do. She starts out with getting everybody together to pray. And then she is able, through her great wisdom, she was a lot smarter than she seemed, to be there and to get the people of Israel saved. So, for me and for you, how do we know that these things that are happening around us aren't presenting to us opportunities to serve the Lord? And if they're there, and we know they do come, let's be like Esther. She was ready to go when she received that opportunity. Thanks.